G'day friends and welcome back one more time. My name is Katie and I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country, the sovereignty of which was never ceded. And I'm filming this in the middle of Reconciliation Week here in Australia, which is a week that marks a couple of important dates. The first being the 1967 referendum, in which the Australian population voted yes to counting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people amongst the population of Australia. And the other anniversary is Mabo, which was when Eddie Mabo went through the court system to fight for his familial land rights, and he won, which prompted the recognition of native title in Australia. And so Reconciliation Week happens around these two really important anniversaries, and it is a time for Australia as a whole to really reflect on our past, for honest truth-telling, for listening, and for hopefully taking action that can lead to healing. I'll leave some links in the description box below where you can find out more about Reconciliation Week if you're interested, but today I just wanted to run through some of my top recommendations for books by Aboriginal authors. I have a whole host of books here that I want to share with you. Some are non-fiction, some are fiction, some are YA, some are adult, more literary books, a wide variety, and basically I just want to really encourage you, especially during Reconciliation Week, but whenever this video finds you, to read from and engage with Aboriginal and Indigenous voices. Also, if you are Australian, definitely take this time to reflect on and research and investigate opportunities for you to actively engage with Aboriginal resistance. Check out your local Warriors for Aboriginal Resistance group, for example, or maybe see if there's a local place for you to pay the rent. In Victoria, I will link our link below. I've been paying the rent for the last few years, and it's something that I'm committed to doing for the rest of my life for as long as I'm earning money. But that's enough of a preamble. Let's talk about some really incredible books. Firstly, I want to talk about Blood by Tony Birch. Now, Tony Birch is a prolific author. He has many books, many short stories. He's been involved in many other anthologies. He's written poetry. He's amazing. But my favorite book of his that I have read so far is definitely Blood. This is quite a hard-hitting, almost thriller sort of story. It centers a young boy named Jesse who lives with his younger sister, his half-sister, and his mum. His mum has a lot of problems. She sort of struggles with drug addiction and jumps back and forth between some really toxic, harmful relationships, and their home life is just very much unsettled. In fact, they don't really have one. They tend to move around quite a lot, which is very difficult for Jesse and his sister. And especially given that he and his sister are only half siblings, his sister in particular is terrified that Jesse will get taken away and that they will be separated. And so they do this sort of blood pact where Jesse promises that they will never be separated, and he takes this promise to his sister very seriously. And we basically follow this small family, and in particular Jesse and his sister, when his mum gets involved with quite a dangerous boyfriend. It's clear that he's involved in some pretty serious criminal activity, and that definitely influences the family and puts them into some really, really dangerous, dire situations. And Jesse, although he's only a young teen, is having to step up and be mature and make decisions to protect himself and his sister that he really shouldn't have to be making at this age. It's essentially a story about poverty and some of the really serious challenges that arise with families put into bad circumstances and how much that affects children in particular. I think it's also an incredible exploration of masculinity and sort of watching Jesse figure out what kind of man he wants to be or feels that he has to be for his little sister, even though he doesn't have any male role models in his life. It's tense, it's fast-paced, and Jesse is just such an incredible character. From the first couple of pages, you will fall in love with him and you will be invested in his story. Tony Birch is an incredible storyteller. This is an amazing book and one I highly recommend. Next up, we have a beautiful YA, which is probably one of my favorite books that I've read in quite a while. It is The Boy from the Mish by Gary Lonesborough. This is a YA title, so it is for young adults, but I would say it's definitely best suited to the older end of that spectrum and to adults who are interested as well. This is about two Aboriginal boys and the friendship and then romance that develops between them. It's a contemporary story set in sort of a regional town in Australia, and Thomas and Jackson just sort of struggle with a whole host of different things relating to school and racism that they experience in the town, familial obligations and what future they want for themselves, and then also, again, an exploration, a beautiful exploration of what masculinity looks like for these two boys. Gary Lonesborough has said that he wrote this to be the book that he wished he'd had as a young Aboriginal boy figuring out his own sexuality. And the friendship and then relationship that these two boys develop together just feels so raw and so authentic and honest. Both of them are just such incredibly well fleshed out characters that feel so distinct. And the way that they navigate their own internal issues, both independently and together, is just honestly one of the most beautiful things I've read. It's one of those books that really walks the line of being really honest and raw and brutal in some ways, but at the same time so wholesome and heartwarming that it's just gorgeous. If you're looking for a little bit of romance, but still something that has plenty of meat and substance to it, this is absolutely a book for you. It's just gorgeous. Now for something that will take you no time to read. This is Living on Stolen Land by Ambelin Kwaymullina. And this cover is gorgeous and it's written in verse and it's not very long, so very, very quick, easy to read. This is a declaration of decolonization and it really aims to challenge the reader about assumptions and presumptions of superiority of Western thought, of Western perspective, and of Western entitlement to land. It points out things like the harmfulness of performative activism and what being an ally actually should look like. It even challenges like Western ideas of time and how there's an expectation that things in the past should be left in the past, which is often used to dismiss the very real harm that continues today. Although it's short, it definitely packs a punch and covers quite a broad range of topics. It's so effective and brilliantly done. Now, one that I definitely think is not for everybody and is far from easy to read, that is Carpentaria by Alexis Wright. This is huge. It took me like 2 or 3 weeks to read. It was a commitment. But I also personally think that this is one of the greatest achievements of literature that I've ever read. And if I could make everybody read one book, it might be this. It is a hard book to sort of talk about because even though there certainly is a plot, there certainly are characters, it's sort of not just about the plot and the characters. I read this in a reading vlog, I think last year, and in that I think I described this as feeling almost like it has the same feeling as like those big, grand oral myths. And although it is set in a fictional town in far north Queensland, this is definitely allegorical for Australia as a whole and the colonisation and land appropriation and the harm that has been done across the continent. The land itself and the ancestors are as much an active part of this story as any other character, and it's just absolutely beautiful. It's some of the most beautiful, intricate writing that I've ever read. But like I said, it is pretty hard to get through. So although I would highly, highly recommend it, I'd also say just be patient with yourself and give yourself time because this is something that is worth that time and effort. I read it last year and I have not stopped thinking about it since. That is just how impactful and incredibly well told and executed Carpentaria is. It's wholly unconventional from like the narrative itself right down to individual sentence structure. This is one of those books that's just an experience that will stay with you. Speaking of experiences that will stay with you, My Place by Sally Morgan is one of my favorite nonfiction reads of all time. This is Sally Morgan's memoir, and it is from the 1980s, so it's a little dated. And it is a little slow to start because we literally get to know Sally right from her early childhood up until, you know, her present day back then. But it's basically the story of her and her family and she realizing at a young age, at about 8, I think from memory, that she and her family are Aboriginal. Her grandmother is Aboriginal, so is her mother, but her father is a white Australian. And so the stigma around Aboriginal children and like the issues around the stolen generation and the threat of literally losing their children has meant that this family has kept their heritage a secret. And at one point they literally tell Sally that she's Indian because they figure that's safer and easier for her to get away with telling kids at school. Sally is a very confident, forward kind of kid. And although that was a little challenging to read at the beginning, as we move throughout the book, we see how that tenacity in her really means that she is willing to go the distance to find out more about her family's past. And watching her as she uncovers this history and not only learns it for herself and reclaims her identity in a way that just feels so revolutionary, she also allows space for the women in her life who have been holding on to this secret through absolute fear and terror to finally be free as well. And it's just one of the most beautiful, impactful things I've ever read. It's at once a hugely intimate story about a very specific family and also a really important history lesson about Australia and the policies around the stolen generation and of assimilation and what that did to people and to families. For me, this was one of the most important books that I think I've ever read. It's absolutely essential reading for all Australians in my point of view, and definitely a worthwhile read for anyone, I think. Another YA title that I wanted to share with you is Catching Tella Crow by Ambelin and Ezekiel Kwaymullina. Yes, Ambelin Kwaymullina is making it twice on this list. She's that good. This was my most recent read out of all of these, and this is just incredible. It's basically like a ghost story murder mystery, but that doesn't even give you the half of how good this book is. It is written in both just prose, but then also we get parts that are written in verse. It's told from the perspective of Beth, who is dead. She's a ghost. She died in a car accident, and she's basically stayed with her father. Her mother was Aboriginal, her father is a white Australian. Her mother died a long time ago, and her father is just really struggling with the loss of, well, his wife and now also his only daughter. He's a police officer, and he basically gets assigned to oversee an investigation happening in another town. Everyone thinks it's going to be a pretty cushy job, and they put him there thinking that that will sort of ease him back into his work, give him something to do without it being too stressful. But of course, it develops into a much bigger mystery, and Beth sort of helps him figure out what's going on in this town. This seemingly small mystery sort of unravels and snowballs into Beth and her father uncovering a whole host of crimes that have been covered up in this town over a span of decades. Most of these pertain to the abduction and sexual assault of Aboriginal children. So it is very hard hitting, but I will say that it is all handled incredibly well. It's hugely effective and impactful, and it's just incredible. Like, the writing itself is stellar, and then the story as well, and the characters that you get to know throughout, and the way that the history of this land and of this community unravels is just, it's a whirlwind. But it doesn't read like a thriller. It doesn't like preference the surprise and the suspense over the real world impact on individual people and their families. I would say that this is pretty heavy, but it would be appropriate for 14, 15 plus. Then another memoir that I wanted to recommend. This is Maybe Tomorrow by Boori, Monty, Pryor and Mimi McDonald. This is Boori's story of pretty much his whole life. Boori is a storyteller. He travels around Australia and goes into schools and goes into public spaces and tells stories and tries to make connections and to fight the racism that is so prevalent in Australia. And this is his story of what it was like growing up and his journey through different challenges in his life and in his family to why he does what he does now and why he's so passionate about making those connections with people and of storytelling. I read this years ago, but I loved it, and there are many things that have stayed with me about this, but some of the really important ones I think are things like the impact of particular place names and of statues, for example. Boori spent a lot of time in Townsville, which is a place that I grew up partially in. And he talks about things like Dalrymple Road, which is one of the biggest roads through Townsville, and who that road is named after, what that man did. And Boori talks about what seeing names like this plastered all over the place, being elevated and remembered in this way, what that did to him as a young Aboriginal man, how it reinforced the message that he was not welcome and that he was not safe in this place. He spoke about how many of the other elements of racism and dispossession and genocide have affected many of the people that he knows, including the high prevalence of mental illness and suicide in Aboriginal communities. And although he unflinchingly looks at and shares some of the really hard, dark moments of his and his family's lives, he still manages to be such an uplifting, hopeful, optimistic, beautiful presence in this book. He never loses sight of his passion for storytelling and of connections. And although he is sad and hurt by so many of the things that have happened to him and his family, he never allows that to, degrade a sense of grace and love that he has for the world and for the future. He's also just really funny. And I think a less adept storyteller would struggle to straddle all of those lines, but Boori manages to do it with such authenticity, with such grace and such beauty. Of course, I can't have a video recommending Indigenous authors without telling you about The Yield by Tara June Winch. Tara June Winch is another author who has several publications. She's got short stories. She's got 2 other books that I know of. But The Yield is something incredibly special. This is the story of August, who is an Aboriginal woman who's been living in London for the last 10 years. And she comes home to Australia, to her small town where her family is, when she finds out that her grandfather, Poppy, is dying. So her story sort of leading up to his death and then after his death, and what happens with the house that he and his wife have been living in for a long time. That is like the main sort of narrative thread through this story. But we also get two other perspectives. One is from a missionary who founded a reservation or a school in the area in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the letters that he's writing to his contemporaries about what he wants to do at this school and sort of what's happening. And through that, we learn the history of the stolen generation and dispossession in the area and the impacts that it's had. And the third point of view, and the one that I think makes this like exceptional reading, is from Poppy. He knew that he was going to die, so he decided that he wanted to preserve his Aboriginal language. And to do that, he basically writes a dictionary, and we read his dictionary throughout the story. But rather than like just giving us straight up definitions of the words, he basically like explains the meaning of the word through story. And so we learn about his life and his experience and the history of the land and his family and his connection to his heritage. So through the dictionary, he's both preserving his language, but also his legacy. And it's just incredible. And the way that these three points of view come together throughout the story, and how we learn so much more about the overall context of what's going on. And we see August go through a fight for native title and land rights for her family. It's just incredible. It's a hugely compelling story exploring the importance of preservation of language and of heritage, and also of dispossession and how those things happened and their continuing impacts today. But it's also a story about the beauty and the intimacy of family. Tarajun Winch has a very distinctive writing style. Like, she has a very strong voice that I personally just love, and I think she pretty much perfected it here in The Yield. Now, this one I don't have here to show you because I'm lending it out to a friend, but I also wanted to recommend Yarrudhanggalangdhuray by Anita Heiss. This is such a beautiful story. It's historical fiction, and I think it's set in the 1800s from memory. Like I said, don't have the book here to sort of double check my facts, but it is centered around a true event, which was the flood of Gundagai. And in this, we follow a young Aboriginal woman who is a servant to a white family in this area. At the beginning of the story, we find out that the Aboriginal people in the area have fled to higher ground because they're expecting the river to flood. But the white people in this new settlement, in this new town, they think that they're going to be fine, so they don't leave. And this white family don't allow the Aboriginal servant that they have named Wogadine to leave either. So inevitably the town floods. It's one of the worst floods in a long time, and many people die. And Wogadine's father and I think uncle from memory basically hop in their boats and spend the whole night trying to rescue people from the town. This is based on true events. This actually happened. After the flood, Wogadine's family decides that they want to move to Wagga Wagga, I think from memory, and they basically insist that she comes with them, and she doesn't have a choice, and she is just absolutely heartbroken about being taken away from her family. And so we follow Wogadine and this white family as they settle in Wagga and sort of the events that unfold from there. Wogadine is one of my favourite characters that I've read ever. She's just absolutely gorgeous. And what I think is really special about this book in particular is not only the writing and how beautiful it is and how gorgeous Wogadine is, but also the relationship Wogadine has with different characters in the book, in particular the white family that she's a servant to. For example, I can't remember her name, but the wife of this family is a Quaker, and she very much considers herself a good white person. She considers herself an Aboriginal ally. I mean, she is a woman in a patriarchal society, so maybe she doesn't have control over everyone and everything, but we see through her actions, in particular, how she treats Wogadine and what she expects of Wogadine, that she is very much an active participant in colonialism, of dispossession. There is also one of the most beautiful, tender romances I've read in here as well, so if you're a romance reader, this might be the one for you. Although this definitely tackles some of the pretty horrific moments of Australian history, Anita Heiss has such a light hand, and she never shies away from being honest about the past. She still manages to make this novel overall feel really readable and enjoyable, and I think primarily that is because of just how good of a character Wogadine is. She's amazing. And then finally, I wanted to end on a very short but highly impactful read, and that is Truth, Tradition and Tomorrow by Galarrwuy Yunupingu. This is literally like 50 pages long. I read this in one sitting. It's very, very easy to read, but very important too. Galarrwuy lives in Arnhem Land, and he's been widely recognised by both white Australia and Indigenous Australia for his contributions to his Aboriginal community. In the 70s and 80s in particular, he was really active in seeking out audiences to ensure land rights for his people. He understood just how important true land rights are, not just on like a moral level, but also just in terms of self-determination and sovereignty. And through this very short book, he talks about his life growing up and what sort of inspired him to become so active and become such an active voice in seeking land rights for his people. And he talks about the different prime ministers that he's met with, the different ministers of different levels, and the different important people throughout Australia that he has gone to meet with or he's invited to talk to in Arnhem Land, and how ultimately he is promised the world by so many people, and yet he has failed time and time again. It's a story of determination, but also one of huge disappointment. He writes so clearly. So if land rights isn't something that you've like read a lot about, or you haven't engaged in the conversation a huge amount before, I think this is a very accessible read. And because it's so personal as well, you can learn a lot about the direct impacts of being denied access to land and why land rights are so important. Anyway, those are my top 10 books by Aboriginal and Indigenous authors that I wanted to share with you today. I have plenty more that I could recommend, but I wanted to keep this list nice and tight, but still diverse and interesting enough that I think, you know, regardless of your taste and your interests, you should be able to find something on here that could strike your fancy. There's also some incredible picture books out at the moment that are great conversation starters, or even just introductions to different parts of Australian history. For example, Freedom Day, which is an amazing introduction and exploration of the Wave Hill Walk-Off and Vincent Lingiari's contribution. Or Somebody's Land, which is a great accessible way to start having the conversation with children about sovereignty and how that was never ceded, and why recognition of that fact is really important. If you'd like me to do a recommendations video for children's books specifically, let me know. Otherwise, I'm sure I'll be back sometime in the future talking more about Indigenous authors here on this channel, because it's something that I think is really important, and there's just some incredible stories and non-fiction out on the market that are amazing reads. If you have any further recommendations for me, please leave those in the comments below. I'm always looking for recommendations. I really hope you found a book or two to add to your TBR, and thank you so much for watching. And especially big thank you goes to my patrons over on Patreon, and especially to Livia, Lynette Brown, Laurie, and Ian Yetzak for their very generous support. And until next time, happy reading and so much love. Bye.